This morning, America is waking up without Dolly Parton.
For more than 60 years, Dolly Parton walked onto stages covered in rhinestones. They were on her dresses, her jackets, her shoes. Under the bright lights of Nashville, Las Vegas, television studios, and concert halls, those little stones became part of the Dolly millions of people knew and loved. But when Dolly thought about the place where she would finally rest, she apparently wanted something very different. No glitter, no grand display, no elaborate final image. According to her nephew, Brian Seaver, Dolly wanted to rest in what he described as a beautiful bed of plush cotton. And the reason he gave was so simple that longtime fans may recognize Dolly in it immediately. After spending so much of her life wearing heavy rhinestones, she wanted to finally be comfortable, to rest. For a woman whose image had always been larger than life, there is something surprisingly tender about that request. You can almost picture those costumes hanging backstage, the blonde wigs carefully prepared, the sparkling dresses waiting beneath the lights, and then, away from all of that, the woman underneath simply asking for something soft. Brian revealed the wish on August 25, 2026, when he announced that his aunt had died at the age of 80. But there was something else in his message that may have been even more difficult for him to say. Dolly had asked him to do this years earlier. She had chosen Brian to be the person who would one day tell the world that she was gone. He was not simply a nephew who happened to be available when the family needed someone to speak. Brian had served as Dolly's head of security for more than 2 decades. Before him, his father Larry had held that responsibility. For years, 2 generations of the same family had stood beside Dolly as her life took her from one city to another, one performance to another, one stage to another. And somewhere along the way, Dolly gave Brian one more responsibility. Someday, when the time came, she wanted him to speak for her. Brian admitted that when she originally made that request, he had not fully understood what it would feel like when the imagined moment became real. Then, it did. And if Dolly Parton was part of the soundtrack of your own life, if you remember hearing Jolene or I Will Always Love You coming through the radio years ago, tell us in the comments which Dolly song takes you back immediately. For many people, those songs are connected to places and people they have never forgotten. What makes Brian's announcement even harder to hear is what Dolly herself had been saying just days earlier. On August 21st, only 4 days before her death was announced, Dolly spoke publicly about her health. She did not pretend that everything had been easy. She acknowledged that she had been going through what she called hard times with my health. She also admitted something deeply personal. Dolly said she had health problems that she simply had not paid enough attention to while she was taking care of her husband, Carl Dean. Carl had died in March 2025 at the age of 82. They had been married for nearly 60 years. Think about that for a moment. For decades, the public watched Dolly move constantly. Records, movies, television, Dollywood, interviews, charity work, new songs, new ideas. But during one of the most difficult periods of her private life, she was doing something millions of wives and husbands understand very well. She was watching over the person she loved, and her own needs came second. Even after Carl was gone, and Dolly finally began dealing more seriously with her own health, she was still talking about work. She was still talking about plans. 4 days before her death, she said there were still many things she wanted to accomplish. That may be the most painful detail of all, because Dolly had already made arrangements for the day when she would no longer be here. She had chosen who would speak. She had even thought about how she wanted to rest. And yet she was still looking ahead, still planning, still working, still being Dolly. Perhaps that is why Brian's description of that soft bed of cotton stays with you. After all those decades beneath the lights, she had asked for something quiet, something comfortable, something that sounded like rest. And to understand why the final year of Dolly Parton's life had become so different from the life the public had always seen, we have to talk about the man who had been waiting for her at home since she was only 18 years old, Carl Dean. To millions of people, Dolly Parton belonged to the stage. To Carl Dean, she was simply Dolly. That difference may explain why their marriage lasted almost 60 years. Dolly met Carl in Nashville in 1964, just after she arrived in the city as a teenager chasing a music career. She was only 18. He was 21. Their first meeting was not glamorous. There were no television cameras, no record executives, and no rhinestones. They met outside the wishy-washy laundromat. Dolly would later remember that Carl called out to her from his pickup truck. At first, she was cautious. Then, they began talking. 2 years later, on May 30th, 1966, they were married in Ringgold, Georgia. And from that point forward, something unusual happened. Dolly became more famous every year. Carl became more private. While she traveled from Nashville to television studios, movie sets, and concert stages, Carl largely stayed away from the public side of her life. He rarely appeared at industry events. He did not seem interested in celebrity. Dolly once explained that he simply did not want that life. It could have created distance between them. Instead, Dolly often said it helped their marriage. Only a few months before Carl died, she spoke about the relationship on Bunny Zoe's podcast. Dolly said that love and respect mattered, but she also came back to something much simpler. They made each other laugh. She described Carl as quiet while she was loud. Anyone who had watched Dolly on television could probably imagine that difference immediately. She could fill a room. Carl did not need to. And after all the applause ended, that may have been exactly what Dolly needed. She once described some of her perfect days as simply spending time with him at home, not performing, not being introduced, not having to be Dolly Parton for anyone, just being with Carl. There is something especially moving about that now, because the final chapter of their marriage was not spent under stage lights. It was spent much more quietly. Carl's health declined, and Dolly stayed close to him. After his death on March 3, 2025, Dolly told the public that words could not properly describe the love they had shared for more than 60 years. Later, she admitted that while taking care of Carl, she had neglected some of her own health problems. That detail matters, because anyone who has ever cared for a husband, wife, parent, or sibling through a difficult illness knows how easily that can happen. You make the appointment for them. You remember their medicine. You watch whether they have eaten. You listen for them moving in another room. And somewhere along the way, you stop listening quite as closely to your own body. Dolly did not present herself as a victim of that choice. She simply said that she had been watching over Carl and had not paid enough attention to herself. For many women who spent decades caring for families before thinking about their own needs, those words may sound very familiar. If that part of Dolly's story reminds you of someone you loved and cared for, you do not need to share anything private. Just leave a heart in the comments for the caregivers who quietly put somebody else first. After Carl died, Dolly tried to return to work, but the loss stayed with her. In one of her final major interviews, she spoke openly about grief. She said she was trying to honor Carl through the work she continued to do, including the Broadway musical based on her life. She was not pretending that losing him after nearly 6 decades was easy. But Dolly had always known how to keep moving while carrying something painful with her, and Carl had been there for almost the entire journey. He had known her before Jolene, before 9 to 5, before Dollywood, before the movies, before the awards, before the world decided that the blonde woman from East Tennessee belonged to everybody. He had known the 18-year-old girl standing outside a laundromat in Nashville. That is why Brian Seaver's words after Dolly's death carried such emotional weight. When he spoke about where he believed Dolly was now, he did not talk about fame. He talked about reunion. He said he believed she had been welcomed by Jesus, by her parents, by loved ones who had gone before her, and by Carl, for a family rooted so deeply in faith. That was not a decorative phrase. It was the language they used to make sense of goodbye. And Dolly herself had spoken about death in much the same way long before her final days. She did not usually describe it as a complete ending. Her faith gave her a very different picture of what might come next. Which brings us back to that final request: the soft cotton, the rest, the comfort. Because long before Dolly Parton became the woman in rhinestones, she was a little girl in the mountains of East Tennessee, growing up in a house where faith, music, and family were woven into almost everything. And one of the most famous pieces of clothing she would ever sing about was not covered in jewels at all. It was made from scraps. Long before there were rhinestones, there were scraps of cloth. Long before Dolly Parton became one of the most recognizable women in America, she was one of 12 children growing up in the mountains of East Tennessee. The family lived in a small cabin near Locust Ridge, outside Sevierville. There was no electricity, no running water. Money was scarce, and with so many children under one roof, almost nothing was wasted. But Dolly never spoke about that childhood as if love had been scarce, too. Her mother, Avie Lee, filled the house with songs, stories, and faith. Dolly later credited her with much of the imagination that would shape her songwriting. Her father, Lee Parton, worked hard to provide for the family, farming and taking construction jobs when he could. Dolly inherited something from each of them. From her mother, the stories. From her father, the determination to work. And one of those childhood stories stayed with her for the rest of her life. When Dolly needed a warm coat, her mother did not go to a store and buy one. She took pieces of fabric that had been given to the family and stitched them together. Different colors, different shapes. A coat made from what they had. As Avie Lee sewed, she told young Dolly the biblical story of Joseph and his coat of many colors. She wanted her daughter to understand that something did not have to be expensive to be precious. Dolly was proud of that coat. Then she wore it to school, and the other children laughed. They saw rags. Dolly saw her mother's hands. They saw poverty. She saw something made especially for her. Years later, Dolly turned that memory into Coat of Many Colors, one of the songs that would become inseparable from her name. She wrote it in 1969 while traveling with Porter Wagoner. According to Dolly's own official account, there was no ordinary writing paper nearby, so she began putting the lyrics down on the back of Porter's dry cleaning receipts. Even that detail feels wonderfully appropriate. A song about a handmade coat being written on receipts for expensive stage clothes. By the time the song was released in 1971, Dolly was already becoming famous. But she never tried to hide where she had come from. She sang about it. She talked about it. Eventually, she even recreated the family cabin at Dollywood, so visitors could see the kind of place where the story had begun. For people who grew up in the same generation as Dolly, this part of her story may feel familiar in ways younger audiences do not always understand. Clothes were repaired. Things were handed down. Nothing useful was thrown away simply because it was old. And a mother could take something ordinary and make it valuable because of the care she put into it. If you grew up with a mother or grandmother who sewed, patched clothes, saved fabric, or somehow made a little go a long way, tell us where you are watching from. I have a feeling many people listening to Dolly's story will recognize a piece of their own childhood in hers. Faith was woven into those memories too. Dolly began singing in church when she was still a child. The Bible stories her mother told were not simply stories she heard once and forgot. They became part of the way she understood hardship, family, and hope. That faith stayed with her even after everything around her changed. After the television shows, after Nashville, after Hollywood, after the millions of records, even near the end of her life. People close to Dolly described her faith as one of the reasons she continued looking forward despite her health struggles. And suddenly, that final request Brian Seaver revealed sounds even more personal. Think about the two images. A little girl wrapped in a coat made from scraps because her mother wanted her to feel loved. And many decades later, an 80-year-old woman who had spent a lifetime beneath heavy rhinestones, asking to rest in soft cotton. We do not need to pretend Dolly planned some hidden symbolism between those two moments. There is no evidence that she did. But both belong to the same life, a life that began with very little, and one in which the simplest things often carried the deepest memories. Dolly eventually had enough money to buy almost anything she wanted, yet some of the things she valued most could never be measured that way. Carl's company, her mother's stories, her father's pride, her faith, and children receiving something as simple as a book in the mail, because one painful fact about her own father would eventually lead Dolly to create what may be the most personal legacy she ever left behind. Dolly Parton and Carl Dean never had children of their own. For years, people asked her about it. Sometimes Dolly admitted that she had wondered what motherhood might have been like, but as she grew older, she came to believe that her life had taken a different path for a reason. She had nieces and nephews she adored. She had godchildren. She had young performers who looked to her for advice. And eventually, she had millions of children receiving books with her name on them. That story began with her father. Robert Lee Parton was one of the people Dolly admired most in the world. He worked hard. He farmed. He took construction jobs. He raised 12 children with very little money and, according to Dolly, possessed a kind of practical intelligence she respected deeply. But there was something he had never been given the chance to learn. He could not read or write. Dolly never spoke about that as if her father lacked intelligence. Quite the opposite. She once called him the smartest man she had ever known. What bothered her was knowing that his inability to read may have closed doors that should have been open to him. So in 1995, Dolly did something about it. She started the Imagination Library in Sevier County, Tennessee, the same place where she had grown up. The idea was beautifully simple. A child would receive a book in the mail every month from birth until the age of 5. No bill. No requirement that the parents prove they were struggling financially. Just a book arriving at the house with the child's own name on the package. Imagine that scene for a moment. A little boy or girl walking to the mailbox, a package addressed directly to them. A parent or grandparent opening it at the kitchen table. Then someone sitting down that evening and turning the first page. That happened again and again. Then it spread far beyond Tennessee. By the final years of Dolly's life, the program had grown into an international effort, serving children in several countries and sending millions of books into homes every month. In 2025, the Imagination Library celebrated having given away more than 300 million books. But for Dolly, the number was never the most important part. Her father was. She said that before he died, he told her the Imagination Library was probably the most important thing she had ever done. Think about everything Dolly Parton had accomplished by then. The records, the television shows, the movies, Jolene, 9 to 5, I Will Always Love You, awards lined up across decades. And yet the words she remembered most proudly from her father were about books being sent to children. She said she could hardly explain what that meant to her, because she had created the program as a tribute to him. There is another part of this story that becomes especially meaningful when you remember that Dolly never became a mother herself. She once explained that perhaps if she had had children, she would not have been able to do everything she eventually did. She did not say that without emotion. She had wondered about it, but with time, she came to feel that maybe her life had simply been meant to reach children in another way. And perhaps some of you listening understand that too. Families do not always look the way we imagined when we were young. Sometimes love arrives through children. Sometimes through nieces and nephews. Sometimes through grandchildren. Sometimes through people we never expected to care for. And sometimes, in Dolly's case, it arrived in a cardboard package with a book inside. If you ever read stories to your children or grandchildren at bedtime, tell us in the comments what book they asked for over and over again. Those little memories have a way of staying with us much longer than we expect. By the time Dolly reached her final years, Children who had received some of the earliest imagination library books were old enough to have families of their own. Some were now reading to their own sons and daughters. That is a kind of legacy Dolly could actually see happening while she was alive, and it explains something important about the way she thought about what would remain after her. She did not have to leave everything behind in the form of monuments. She had songs playing on radios. She had books sitting on shelves. She had families who would never meet her, but whose children had grown up with something she helped place in their hands. And still, even with all of that continuing after her, Dolly kept looking forward. Only 4 days before her death, she said there were still so many things she wanted to accomplish. She did not sound finished, but years earlier, she had quietly made sure one person knew what to do when the day finally came: her nephew Brian. And when he was finally forced to keep that promise, the words he chose made Dolly's last request feel even more personal. When Brian Seaver finally sat down to deliver the message Dolly Parton had asked him to give years earlier, he already knew there was no perfect way to say it. He had spent more than 2 decades protecting his aunt. Before him, his father Larry had done the same. Brian had first gone on the road with Dolly when he was still a child in the early 1980s, watching from the side as the woman his family knew simply as Dolly became something much larger to the rest of the world. And now he had been given one final job: tell everyone she was gone. Brian said he had imagined the weight of that moment many times, but imagining it was not the same as living it. Then he said something that may have brought comfort to people who had followed Dolly for most of their lives. The sadness, he explained, belonged to those who were left behind, not to Dolly. In the language of the faith that had been part of her life since childhood, Brian said the family believed she was now with Jesus, reunited with Carl, her parents, and other loved ones who had gone before her. After everything Dolly had endured in those final years, that image carries a different weight. Carl was there in Brian's words, the man she had met when she was 18, the man who had known her before the television appearances, before the movies, before Jolene, before anyone outside Tennessee had a reason to remember the name Dolly Parton. He had been gone since March 2025. Now, in the family's faith, the separation was over. And then Brian shared the request that has stayed with so many people since his announcement. Dolly had called him and told him that when her time came, she wanted to rest in a beautiful bed of soft cotton. After a lifetime of wearing heavy rhinestones, she told him, she finally deserved to be comfortable. It sounds almost like a Dolly Parton joke, and maybe there was a little humor in it. She had always known exactly how the world saw her. The hair, the makeup, the heels, the glitter. She could laugh at all of it because she was the one who had created it. But underneath that humor was something much quieter: rest. That was what she wanted. Not another stage, not another award, not another night beneath hot lights in a dress covered in stones. Just comfort. The family has said that Dolly will be laid to rest in a small private service attended by immediate family. Fans have instead been encouraged to remember her publicly, including through tributes and support for the Imagination Library she spent decades building. That choice feels consistent with the woman behind the celebrity. The public part of Dolly's life had always been enormous. Her goodbye did not need to be. And perhaps that is why this final request has touched so many people. Because after everything we have remembered in this story, the cotton no longer feels like a strange detail. We have seen the little girl whose mother stitched a coat from scraps, the young woman who arrived in Nashville with a dream, the wife who spent almost 60 years loving a man who preferred life away from the cameras, the daughter who created a reading program because her father had never been given the chance to learn, the woman who never had children of her own but helped put hundreds of millions of books into the hands of other people's children, and finally, the 80-year-old Dolly, still talking about things she wanted to accomplish only days before her death. She had spent a lifetime giving people reasons to smile, sometimes through a song, sometimes through a joke, sometimes through a book arriving in a child's mailbox. And even Brian, speaking through his grief, reminded people of something Dolly herself had understood better than almost anyone. She had somehow become part of our homes, first on the radio, then on the television, later on CDs and phones. For some people, Dolly Parton had been there for 50 or 60 years without ever walking through the front door. That is why her death can feel strangely personal. If Dolly was part of your life too, I want to ask you one final question. Do not simply tell us your favorite song. Tell us where that song takes you. Does Coat of Many Colors remind you of your mother? Does 9 to 5 take you back to a job you had 40 years ago? Does I Will Always Love You bring back someone who is no longer here? Leave that memory in the comments, because those memories are where artists like Dolly continue to live. Brian ended his announcement with words that needed no explanation. She will always love you. And after a lifetime beneath all those rhinestones, Dolly Parton finally asked for something much simpler: a soft place to rest and peace.